Tensions are escalating between America and China. American military leaders are talking about war in 2027 or even 2025. The focal point is Taiwan, but the conflict is about bigger issues than just Taiwan. It's about Chinese and American military presence in the Western Pacific. It's about trade and economic competition, about diplomatic rules of a changing world, and it's about cultural clashes between Western and Chinese civilization, about different interpretations of Western and Chinese history. Even bigger than that, Chinese leaders have said the world is going through changes that have not been seen for 100 years. Think about what has happened in China in the last 100 years. We should all pay attention to these issues if we are going to avoid a war between China and the United States. Leaders do, citizens do. But what is the ordinary citizen? What is the curious YouTube viewer realistically able to do to reduce tensions between the leaders of America and China? Well, you can make up your own mind and you can read a little bit of good history. A little bit of good history will give you a more nuanced understanding of what's going on in the world today, will help you pay mindful attention to the events that you're bombarded with in the news, and help you stay sane with a change in perspective, a better understanding of everyone who is involved. And in a minute, I'm going to give you a really crucial insight from that first set of 7 insights from 7 historians about how China was part of the Cold War too, and you can't really understand events playing out today without that understanding. But first, let me just say a little bit about, these videos overall. But the history of China is enormous, so where do you start? So much has been written, so much good history, so much appallingly bad history, so much propaganda as well. I try to make videos about history, the best books in history, and how it's all playing out on the geopolitical stage, the cultural stage, the changing multipolar world order. I'm trying to connect the events of the past with the events we see on the nightly news, on our Twitter feeds, on our Instagram. I've done a series of videos making recommendations on some of the best books that you can read about history that will help you understand what's going on in the world today. What's going on in Ukraine? What's going on in Russia? What's going on in India and geopolitics? And I've just started making this new series on 7 insights from 7 historians that help you understand what's going on between the United States and China and how you can play your part in diffusing the conflict. I try to boil these big, long history books into 10, 20, 30-minute videos and give you a taste for what is the kind of insights that you can gain and the kind of ways you can make use of these books for your own life to sort of save history from the boring experience you might have had at school or university, but also make it a little bit friendlier and more accessible, because if you can find the right books and you can find the right stories, it will help you live better in today's multipolar world. Do it as someone who's a trained historian, a lifelong student of history and of world affairs and a former government official. I'm no expert on all these issues of China and India, but what I do bring is a curious and an open mind and 33 years of practice, I guess, as a government official of trying to boil down really complicated situations and present them in a clear, meaningful way that you can translate into your own life. I also have a free weekly newsletter on Substack, Jeffrich, jeffrich.substack.com. And you can sign up there for free, and I'll give you a weekly glimpses into the multipolar world, what I'm reading, some of the big events, and some of the surprises, the biggest surprise every week that I've learnt. I've released this previous video on 7 insights from 7 historians that just might help us avoid a war between the United States of America and China. And this video is going to go into a little bit more depth about one of those key insights from one of those key historians. And the insight is that China was part of the Cold War too, and you can't understand events today without understanding that, and you need to avoid the bad stuff about the Cold War and look for a new way. The historian is a Norwegian historian, Odd Arne Westad, who's written this fantastic book, The Cold War, A World History. And at the end of the video, I'm going to share one surprising great story from that book that is directly relevant to the conflict in Taiwan today. So make sure you stick around to the end of the video to get this fantastic story. Odd Arne Westad has written this book here, The Cold War, A World History. He's quite a distinguished historian. I think he has some level of specialized knowledge of China, but he sort of has written a lot about the history of the Cold War. And the great insight you pick up from that is the Cold War was not just between America and Russia. It was between the Western world, let's say, and the communist world, including its two great powers of Russia and China. And so this global perspective on the Cold War helps reframe the perspective of the last 30 years since the Cold War about the relation between China and the United States. The apparent victor, the United States of the Cold War, perhaps certainly the victor of the Cold War, if not the successful negotiator of a peace after the Cold War, and China. So this is a terrific book full of lots of insight, and he has some great comments towards the end of the book in his conclusion, where he describes the world the Cold War made. And there he really refers to the problem of, I guess, American triumphalism after the Cold War. The Cold War was over and the United States had won it. But most Americans still believed that they could only be safe if the world looked significantly more like their own country and if the world's governments abided by the will of the United States. This triumphalism ultimately became known as the liberal rules-based international order. So he makes those comments, and he also comments particularly around China's perceptions of the end of the Cold War. He talks about the looting of the century of Russia in the 1990s, provoked by the end of the Cold War. But he Also here comments around China often being seen as one of the main beneficiaries of the Cold War, but this was not entirely true. And here he writes, the end of the Cold War came as a complete shock to the Chinese leaders, who suddenly realized that they, in part due to their own efforts combating the Soviets, would be left to face the Americans in a unipolar world. From the Chinese perspective, the wrong superpower collapsed. They had believed that at least long term, the USSR was in ascendance while the United States was declining. From the 1990s on, the Chinese Communist Party was terrified that US influence would subvert its rule at home and hem it in abroad, including among its Asian neighbours. So profound insight there, I think, about the Cold War, China's role, and how that sort of frames our understanding of this current situation. And Odd Arne Westad has, towards the end of 2022, also co-wrote an article with a Chinese expert, Li Chen, who's an associate professor at the School of International Studies at Renmin University of China, I think it's in the American magazine Foreign Affairs, no less. Here it refers to the whole argument that maybe we're entering Cold War II, US-China after US-Russia. And what they say is that the question of whether US-Chinese competition bears much resemblance to the Soviet-American Cold War has become highly contested. But most agreed that it offered at least some lessons for managing tensions between the United States and China today. Rather than fixating on disagreements about the analogy, both scholars and policymakers should consider those lessons, especially when it comes to the essential tasks of facilitating stability and reducing the risk of unnecessary conflict. The scholars suggested that the United States and China should strive toward achieving a basic level of trust, even as competition between the two sides continues, noting that the two sides must learn to rely on trustworthy analysis from experts who know the other side well, and to avoid interpreting any friction in terms of worst case scenarios. Don't go to par for what the United States has done with Russia over the last decade or so, or you could say over the last 100 years, but certainly over the last decade. The United States and China need to both work to better understand the strategic aims of the other side. So that's insight one. China was a party to the Cold War II. China is still finding its way out of the international situation created at the end of the Cold War, and it has its very own perspective on that, which is not simply conceding victory to the United States. I promise one story from Odd Arne Westad's The Cold War, A World History, that is directly relevant to the conflict in Taiwan today. And this story relates to the famous reconciliation, I guess, between China and the United States in 1971 when Nixon went to China. And Nixon, who was then President of the United States, met with Mao Zedong and his foreign minister, Mao Zedong, the leader of China, and his foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, in China with his, the American foreign minister, Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger's still alive. He was making comments about the Ukraine war only a couple of months ago at the age, I think, of 99. The story from Odd Arne Westad's The Cold War, A World History, relates to Kissinger's secret trip, in fact, quite covert trip to China to lay the groundwork for this visit. It was actually really more initiated by the Chinese than the Americans, and various intermediaries, including Pakistan, enabled Henry Kissinger to take a flight to Beijing unannounced, unknown to the world, where he met with Zhao Enlai, the foreign minister of China. And what becomes clear in Odd Arne Westad's book is that although these days Henry Kissinger, presents himself as the great statesman who drew China into the American orbit and drew China away from Russia as part of the Cold War, when he arrived in Beijing in 1971 to meet Zhao Enlai, he was incredibly nervous and a little bit intimidated by the extremely formidable Zhao Enlai. Odd Arne Westad takes up the story. On the 8th of July, 1971, Kissinger flew to Pakistan for well-publicized meetings with the leaders there. After the welcome reception on the first evening, Kissinger feigned illness, and his spokesman told reporters that he needed to rest outside Islamabad for a day or so. Instead, Kissinger that night flew secretly on a Pakistani aircraft straight to Beijing, where he was welcomed by Chinese Premier Zhao Enlai, awestruck at being the first American leader, by being the first American leader to visit communist China. Kissinger began reading from a prepared text, a sure sign of nervousness in performance, I can tell you, as a former bureaucrat. Zhao cut him short. China, he said, was hoping for coexistence, equality, and friendship. But for that to happen, the United States, quote, must recognize the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as the sole legitimate government of China and not make any exceptions, just as we recognize the United States as the sole legitimate government, without considering Hawaii, the last state, and Hawaii only became a state of the United States in the 1950s, an exception to your sovereignty, or still less Long Island, the island perhaps not so far off the American coast as Taiwan is off the Chinese coast. In other words, Westad says, the US relationship with Taiwan had to go. And of course, the Americans didn't deliver. And the running sore of the continuing sort of American military presence and dalliance with Taiwan as a separate state continues to this day, and there may well be arguments about keeping Taiwan a democracy, but one should always note that Taiwan was really a military dictatorship until 1991. Indeed, the Soviet Union became democratic before Taiwan. I hope you've enjoyed that insight into China, its history, and how deep and important the conflict in Taiwan is, and how it goes to some fundamental issues of mutual respect and understanding of China and the United States, and genuine, equal, peaceful coexistence in a multipolar world. You can check out the whole playlist on the 7 insights from 7 historians on the China-USA conflict. And I'll see you soon in my next video.